in the CBD, the couple of residents and people here in Zimbabwe that we've spoken to look forward to tomorrow, the big day when the announcement will be made, or rather the swearing in of Emmerson Mnangagwa will be happening. And right behind me, actually, we spotted his convoy. Right behind me is the seat of power. This is the highest office in the land, and we spotted his convoy. As you can see right there behind me, that building, that is where the president's office is. It's also where the cabinet members of Zimbabwe normally meet to have their meetings and so forth. And one can not put it any way than saying that indeed Emmerson is preparing to become president of Zimbabwe, and this, what we're seeing outside this office, is evident of that. And you know, quite interestingly, is opposite this seat of power is another seat of power, and that is the court of the High Court of Zimbabwe, and right next to it is the Constitutional Court of Zimbabwe. And it means that what's going to happen tomorrow, means that the three arms of government take a shift, because there is a new person will be coming in as the head of government, and that is Emmerson, the person who has been the vice president of former president now, Robert Mugabe. Robert Mugabe fired him about 16 days ago, and yesterday he spoke about those 16 days and spoke about how 2 hours after being fired, after getting that letter, he got messages from his security detail that his life was quote unquote under threat because people want to eliminate him. And he comes back 18 days later, he will be president of Zimbabwe.
And you speak of this new power and the arms of the government having to work together under Mnangagwa now, but let's not forget that this is still Zanu-PF that's in power, and Mnangagwa has to sort of instill some sort of confidence in the people. How do Zanu-PF in this transition show that this is not just another way for them to hold on to power?
You know, if I should describe it in any way, I would say that Emmerson faces three very, very difficult tasks. And as you've indicated, that we shouldn't forget that it remains Zanu-PF that is in power. First of all, he has to unite Zanu-PF as well, because within Zanu-PF, there are those people who are still sympathetic to former president now, Robert Mugabe. There are those, for instance, during the last meeting that took place, the last cabinet meeting that was called, and only 5 ministers reportedly showed up for that meeting. There are those that are still sympathetic to him. What happens to the likes of Jonathan Moyo? What happens to the likes of what happens to the likes of Mpoko? Mpoko being the second vice president, who is in Japan at the moment. And earlier on, I saw a report that he was expected to land here in Zimbabwe tomorrow on Friday. However, though, he has decided to take a detour and will be going to Mozambique or either Zambia to seek asylum from those two countries. What happens in that case, and how does he unify Zanu-PF first of all, and also then take on this difficult task of being a minister, or rather of being the head of government that needs to steer Zimbabwe in that direction, that will be able to allow foreign direct investment to come in. Because if you listen to his speech, the speech that he gave yesterday, there was a lot of emphasis around jobs, and rebuilding the economy of Zimbabwe, and he was quite cognizant that it will not only be the support of Zimbabweans to rebuild the economy of Zimbabwe, but also certainly the neighboring countries, like for instance South Africa, like the likes of Botswana, and also speaking about the continent in its entirety, and saying that he also has been receiving messages of support and those other countries outside of Africa that are willing to work with him.
Yeah, and Aldrin, it'll be interesting then to see who he surrounds himself with, because the other sort of villain turned hero was General Chiwenga, who was praised for getting Mugabe out, but people quickly forget that he was sort of a chief enforcer under Robert Mugabe. So what becomes of him now?
What does become of him? Yesterday, if that speech by Emmerson Mnangagwa is anything to go by, he praised him. He praised the Zimbabwe Defense Force for the work that they've done in ensuring this smooth transition of power. also considering the work that has been done by Zanu-PF's Politburo. That Politburo, of course, yesterday he mentioned Robert Mugabe yesterday while speaking on the podium called Robert Mugabe a dictator. And those are some of the issues that one needs to find out what happens now to Zanu-PF and who would be the allies that Emmerson surrounds himself with to ensure that this country moves smoothly into a new transition. But certainly, I was saying earlier on, when you look at the interview that Ian Khama did with BBC Radio, he made it clear that they are willing to work with Emmerson. He also made it clear that it would seem that Zimbabwe's economy seems good enough, fertile enough to such a point where quote-unquote investors will be tripping over each other to come and invest in this country. So Emmerson doesn't only have to surround himself with people who support him in this country, but also the neighboring countries as well. Yesterday we saw visuals of him and President Jacob Zuma, and before that, you know, many months ago, I remember when Robert Mugabe was in the country on an official visit to the country, President Jacob Zuma spoke really highly of Robert Mugabe. Even when Robert Mugabe made his first state visit about 2 years ago, President Jacob Zuma spoke really highly again of Robert Mugabe. What happens now? And the other question is, where is Robert Mugabe? Is he watching this moment taking place in Zimbabwe, where this is the transition of power and a new era is being ushered in the southern region of Africa, but also here in the heart of Zimbabwe?